This episode of the podcast is being sponsored by Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small in New Jersey, with a full service division, from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, camera-ing main lines, to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And as always, if anyone has any comments, questions, or feedback, or to sponsor an episode of the show, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Glenn Dynner, who is a professor and chair of religion at Sarah Lawrence College and a recent Guggenheim Award winner. And we will be discussing one of his books, which is titled Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor, and Life in the Kingdom of Poland. It was published by Oxford University Press. So thank you, Professor Dynner, for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Noah. Appreciate it.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So how much do you want to know about my background, myself? I'm an academic, so I'm supposed to be purely objective and untainted by any bias. But if you want me to be honest, I come to this having grown up very assimilated reform in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., with no strong inspirational figures who would cause me to take Jewish studies so seriously and Judaism and Yiddishkeit so seriously. But halfway through college, I spent my junior year in Israel, and I wound up gradually in pretty from yeshiva or sameach. And then I kind of worked my way back into modern Orthodoxy and then, academic Jewish studies. And that's really where my center is now, is on that cusp of kind of the secular and religious world. And that's why these kinds of topics are so fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, even before we get into specifically the taverns and the liquor and all that kind of thing, I mean, you're interested. I believe you're interested in Hasidus and in Poland in general and Yiddish. I mean, why is that? How did you get into that specific field of Jewish history and Jewish studies?
Well, I think there's a feeling of authenticity about it. And again, as academics, we're trained not to believe that authenticity is the thing, because so many of these traditions we find are constructed or developed in conscious response to forces of modernity. So it's a very tricky thing. And yet I always felt that there was something that's best described as authentic, in terms of knowledge, in terms of commitment and passion. And this I found in East European Jewry in Poland, which is where the vast majority of Jews actually lived before the Holocaust. It's something like 3/4 of the world's Jewish population at the time I write this book, at the time this book occurs in the early 19th century. 3/4 of the world's Jewish population is living in Eastern Europe and lands that used to be part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Okay, so why did you decide to research a topic like taverns and the Jewish involvement in the liquor business? How did you just get to that topic, to researching and writing a book on this?
Well, I came at this as a scholar of Hasidism. My first book, I really tried to deal with the social and political and economic underpinnings of the rise of Hasidism in Poland. But while I'm there in the archives, which had just opened up, it was like the early 1990s, I started noticing words like vodka and drunkenness. This is all in Polish, and Jews and peasants and so on. And I realized that there's this running story throughout the archives, throughout the governmental and secret police documents, that is overly concerned with the role of Jews in the liquor trade, which, as I learned from Polish literature, was absolutely iconic. Jews were the tavernkeepers and distillers of Eastern Europe. And since it's such an agricultural place, especially in the early 19th century, where they're the breadbasket of Europe, Polish Lithuanian wheat is sold throughout Europe. Whatever excess wheat or grain that they can't sell, that they can't export, they're turning it into vodka and selling to their serfs, to their peasants, by means of Jewish lessees, Jews who will lease their taverns and distilleries and sell it directly to their peasants. So it's actually a very tense situation, but it holds for many centuries. There's this kind of economic symbiosis between Jews and nobles. And the ones who get the short end of the stick are the peasants, because they're working the nobleman's land for free. In their spare time, in their leisure time, they're drinking in the nobleman's tavern, which is run and leased by Jews. And so whatever profits they manage to accrue through small-scale trading, it's being siphoned back to the nobleman by means of the Jewish tavern keeper. And that leads to, on the one hand, a lot of resentment against the Jewish tavern keepers on the part of the peasantry, but a huge amount of dependence and really a sense of value in Jews, because they're a little more literate, because they're believed to be more sober. And honestly, the peasants themselves rely on Jews, their Jewish tavern keepers, for all kinds of services, advice, translating and writing letters, medical remedies, matchmaking. You wouldn't believe it. I mean, the Jews, who are supposed to be these pariahs, these ostracized figures in local life, are absolutely indispensable and really at the center of local life by virtue of their role as tavern keepers. And I calculated it's almost half of the Jewish population that's involved in some way in running taverns and distilleries.
Wow. And let's clarify. When you say tavern keeper in a tavern, do you mean, is it merely a bar or a barkeeper, or it's something much more than that?
Yeah, so it really depends on the locale. If we're in villages or along remote country roads, that lead to villages, and these are pretty ramshackle, rough places that are by no means sanitary. They're no means attractive. And the travelers' accounts of these, a lot of British travelers came through Poland and wrote about these places. They make them sound pretty awful, pretty crude. But once you get closer to larger towns and into cities, they could be majestic. They could be really stately inns and built of stone and much more classy establishments. So it's hard to generalize, but I would say the stereotype is definitely a place that's pretty humble. Now, and of course, let me just add to that and say, that physical sense of uncleanliness is used by anti-Semites and social reformers who want to drive Jews out of the liquor trade. It's used as sort of an indictment of Judaism itself. Jews themselves are unclean and unsanitary. Not to mention they deal in this extremely destructive and addictive substance, vodka. And so the tables get turned, so to speak, on the Jewish tavern keepers for their, they have this indispensable service as the only kind of urban island in a rural area. But because of that sordid association with liquor and with uncleanliness, there's mud on the floors and there's lice and straw that you're supposed to sleep on, and the smells and the sounds are offensive to the visitors and so on. That becomes associated with Jewishness in the eyes. And I read a lot of this Polish testimony and British testimony in English, surprisingly enough, which makes that connection. So there's this sense of Jewish uncleanliness that is not helped by the profession, and certainly not helped by the moral problems of the profession either, because it's a pretty rough profession.
For sure. And we'll get back shortly to that sentiment, that anti-Semitic sentiment, that overall sentiment, and then the push to get the Jews out of the liquor business. But before that, maybe briefly just talk about the history of the Jews maintaining and running taverns, I guess, until the time of the book, until the 19th century, when things start to change.
Well, Jews had leased the taverns and nobility probably as early as historians can trace. But it became a thing with the partitions of Poland. Now, I'm not sure how many people know this, but by the end of the 18th century, 1772, 1793, and 1795, Poland was gradually absorbed by its neighbors, by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and wiped off the map of Europe, and became part of these empires. And with these partitions, meaning with the division of Poland, come tariffs. And tariffs are not good for exporting grain because you've got to pay all kinds of fees and taxes to get your grain over the border. And pretty soon there are no profits left. So what do the nobles do? They turn more and more grain into vodka that they can sell on monopolistic terms to their own peasants who are basically slaves. They're serfs. And they're only allowed to drink in their noblemen's taverns. So Jews, as tavern keepers, as trusted sellers of liquor and producers of liquor, become more and more important. And this is beginning in the 19th century. Jews become absolutely crucial to local economies. It's now I've seen it as high as 80% of the state revenues are coming from the taverns and distilleries, from vodka. And by the way, some Jews are really, really getting wealthy off of this profession. It doesn't seem like it because they're very humble on the outside, but this is where the money is. And, if you run it efficiently, you can make a good living running a tavern without expending a huge amount of effort until it catches up to them, until it becomes too lucrative. And then there are all kinds of rationales for driving Jews out of this trade, right? If we get rid of the Jewish tavern keepers, drunkenness will no longer be a problem. Nobody, or very few people managed to notice that even in places of the Tsarist Empire where Jews don't even live, there's peasant drunkenness that's rampant. That's a product of serfdom itself. It's a miserable, miserable institution. But it was easier just to blame Jews rather than to blame the nobles who own the taverns. And here's where the anti-Semitism comes into it. Jews are never entirely safe, and yet economic forms of self-defense, in this case, running a tavern, keeps you relatively secure and prosperous most of the time, until, of course, it doesn't.
I mean, so why was that overall that anti-Semitic attitude, especially you discussed in the book about the clergy, obviously was very anti-Semitic. You want to talk about what their issue was, but was this the overall issue? And then this was, were they just, because of the peasants were just drunk and they saw the Jews as the ones giving them the liquor?
Yeah, I think when we talk about anti-Semitism, it's easy to kind of generalize people hate Jews, but it really depends on the time and place, and it depends on the situation. And in some sense, it's irrelevant, because if Jews prove themselves to be useful and even indispensable, as they did for the first couple of centuries in Eastern Europe, they arrive in the Middle Ages, and then 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, they're seen as indispensable and valuable. The nobility won't care that they're Jews. It's a pragmatic relationship, right? You can use Jews to sell your liquor. And if you don't have Jewish tavern keepers, you're not going to run a profitable tavern, because none of the Jewish merchants traveling through the area are going to be able to stay there for Shabbat, and they won't trust the food. So this becomes a pragmatic kind of arrangement where Jews run the taverns and distilleries and are the nobility's moneymakers, their greatest source of revenue. And the nobility protects them physically from the peasants. This all goes fine until it becomes too lucrative, and until peasant drunkenness becomes a society-wide problem, as it does by the 19th century, when you have improvements in distillery making vodka even stronger and cheaper, and then suddenly Jews are seen as the problem. So it's always the case, I don't care what the industry is, it's always the case that it begins as a kind of self-defense for the community and winds up being the very cause of their persecution in a lot of ways. But if we're going to get more into the specifics, it doesn't look good to have members of an out group, in this case the Jews, of course, selling a highly intoxicating and addictive substance to peasants who are virtually captive customers. It doesn't look good. So, you got to be careful. And there was cheating that went on. I see cases of it that went on, but it didn't go on to the extent that it was claimed because the system wouldn't have borne too much cheating and watering down of vodka and so on. So what you have is a combustible situation that by the 19th century, the myth of the Jewish tavern keeper who's suspiciously sober, while everyone else is getting drunk around them, starts to look very sinister. And by the way, Jews have their own anti-Christian myths. They're drunks, they're violent, they're uneducated, and they're not too bright, and so on. And so you have these myths and counter myths. And I argue in my book, actually, and I refined it even later when I started talking more about it, that these myths serve as boundaries because in these taverns, Jews and Christians are living and drinking and eating in very close proximity. So you need to prevent romances. You need to prevent temptations to convert on both sides. You definitely need to prevent intermarriage. And so these kind of nasty stereotypes on both sides, I think, serve a real social purpose. And that's to keep these groups from mixing too much. And that's where I wouldn't look at the anti-Semitism necessarily too literally. These are kinds of insults that are traded between two groups that want to keep a certain distance from each other. That's not an easy concept to grasp because it can be very offensive, a lot of the rhetoric on both sides. I'm not sure that too many Christians in Poland appreciated being described as violent drunks, but these serve to maintain boundaries. Is my theory anyways.
Okay, so now maybe we have to take a little bit of a detour into the context, into the Polish history. So what happens that the Kingdom of Poland is established? Maybe I guess talk about that like a general Polish history so we can get to the part where the new laws were enacted and things changed officially anyways for the Jews.
So can you please be more specific?
Meaning when we have the Kingdom of Poland, I think what did it say? It was established in 1815, maybe. But I just mean for the listeners who may not be familiar with Polish history at all, what does that mean that the Kingdom of Poland was established and then we'll get to the liquor and tavern aspect that things suddenly changed for the Jews.
Well, when I said that Poland was wiped off the map with the partitions, it wasn't permanently wiped off the map. We have first when Napoleon is temporarily victorious, the establishment of the so-called Duchy of Warsaw. And that lasts from 1807 down to 1815 when Napoleon is defeated. That's a semi-autonomous Poland where you have Polish government officials. Now, they have to ultimately answer to Napoleon, but there's a feeling of independence. Like Poland is somewhat restored. And when Napoleon loses, to the Russians and then is ultimately defeated at Waterloo, the Russians, the Tsarist Empire, takes over that Duchy of Warsaw, renames it the Kingdom of Poland. It's sometimes known as the Congress Kingdom of Poland. And the Tsar becomes the King of Poland. So it's the sort of rump on the Tsarist Empire that is semi-autonomous. The problem is the Poles keep staging uprisings where they can't bear the humiliation of being really ultimately under Tsarist rule. There's all kinds of oppression going on and restrictions. So they staged two uprisings. The first one is in 1830. The second one is in 1863. Both uprisings are eventually put down, and both result in the further curtailment of Polish autonomy until really after 1863, the Kingdom of Poland is really absorbed fully into the Tsarist Empire. And this includes cities like Warsaw and Lublin, really important centers that are now to all extents and purposes, Russian cities. They're colonized in a sense.
Okay, so now, how did things change legally, at least in the laws officially for the Jews, that regarding having taverns and being involved in the liquor business?
Well, a lot of the problem begins with Napoleon, who's smarter than other absolutist monarchs, because the Habsburg or Austrian emperors and the Tsarist emperors would simply expel all the Jewish tavern keepers. And they just expel them from the countryside completely out of the belief that they were the cause of peasant drunkenness. This is what today we call alcoholism, right? And so they'd expel all the Jews from the countryside. But the problem is the nobles, who are the real local power, they see their profits declining. And they don't trust anyone else to run their taverns because they believe, sometimes correctly, that number one, very few non-Jews have the literacy you need. And number two, very few non-Jews have the sobriety that you need to run a successful tavern. Now, this is a bit of a myth, but not entirely so. Jewish tavern keepers usually manage to keep their drinking to a minimum. And so they're valued as both sober and business savvy, and you need them to run a profitable tavern, it seems. And so every time the Jews are expelled, they're secretly brought back. Napoleon gets wise to this, and he says, okay, instead of expelling them, let's just tax them through Jewish-specific liquor taxes, essentially, right? They're excises, concession fees, they're called. You need to pay a concession. And then he raises the concession fees every couple of years. He doubles them and triples them. And he does drive Jews out of the liquor trade this way on paper. The problem is that the Jews, out of desperation, or perhaps a long tradition of experience with various forms of discrimination and persecution, manage to stay in the business, because what they realize is they just need to prop up a Christian tavern keeper and make it look like their tavern is run by a Christian. And they've been doing this all along for centuries, using the Shabbos Goy to keep their taverns running on Shabbat and on Yankel, right, on Jewish holidays. And now they're doing it very naturally to evade state legislation, governmental legislation, even concession fees. So it becomes a vast underground conspiracy, you could say, which the nobles fully support. And the locals are forced to support as well, because they have to obey the noblemen. And everybody is pretty much covering for their Jewish tavern keeper. And it's interesting because the whole history of rabbinic legislation really teaches us how this is done. You can't use the Gentile as an agent if you're going to break Shabbat. You have to make him into a fictitious partner. He has to own 1/7 of the profits, and all kinds of elaborate contracts are drawn up. And that long experience of evading rabbinic law, by receiving a heter, by receiving a rabbinic dispensation, is now transferred to the nobleman who writes his own heter, so to speak. But I've seen it in the contracts where it's written in that so-and-so Gentile will be the face of the tavern, right? He'll be the front. But of course, the Jewish tavern keeper is continuing to be the main supplier of liquor and fulfill every function that a tavern keeper would fulfill, except literally serving the vodka. That's something that you have the Gentile bartender do. And so the system continues underground, but it's, of course, a huge open secret. And every once in a while, they get busted, and the government seems to be surprised to discover this going on. And what amazes me about it is how local Christians, including the noblemen, really almost essentially the noblemen, will cover for the Jewish tavern keeper. And it's an amazing example of a kind of a symbiosis, that everyone's in on it. They're protecting their Jewish tavern keeper because they like him and doesn't cheat them overly, and he's reliable for advice and all kinds of services. And who the hell is the czarist official anyways? Why do I have to answer to him? I should have authority on my own land, on my own estates. So it survives long past historians once believed it survived, right? They thought, okay, it's on the law books. That's the end of Jewish tavern keeping. What I find, and I think I blew this whole thing wide open, is that the Jewish tavern keeper survives into the 20th century.
So the nobles, why did the nobles want the Jews in charge? Is what you're saying just because of the assumed or the actual that they were sober and because they were just better businessmen? And why did they consistently and still want the Jews there?
Well, one reason I alluded to before, and that is that you have all these traveling Jewish merchants. And if they don't have a place to stay, especially on Shabbat, or they can't really trust, what happened to the leaven comments during Passover, right? What do you do about the utensils and so on and so forth? How can I trust this establishment? Those merchants are not going to come into that nobleman's domain. They're going to avoid it, and that kills the local economy. So you need Jewish tavern keepers for economic reasons, but the reason I see it just as frequently is this image of Jewish sobriety, that Jews are not going to drink up the product. And anytime we experiment with peasants, or other local Christians, they drink it up, they give free drinks to their friends, and you can really only rely on Jews to run these establishments. Now, what's fascinating to me as a historian of Hasidism is that the Hasidim managed to maintain that image of sobriety at a time when actually drinking becomes quite permissible and even sanctified. In Hasidus, this is, I don't want to go overboard with it because you get into Maskilic satire, but there was a permissibility that you hadn't seen before, that you could attain great spiritual heights with the help of vodka. And that vodka, if, imbibed under the auspices of the Rebbe and combined with singing and dancing and a good, a good vort, a good Devar Torah, a good sermon, discourse, we should say, that is all part of the all ingredients to achieving devekut, achieving communion with God, and a state of spiritual ecstasy and attachment, and so vodka becomes part of this culture. So my question was, how on earth do they still maintain that reputation for sobriety when reports of Hasidic drinking are pretty amazing? I mean, there was a lot of drinking going on. And the answer I found is, number one, the Hasidim don't just drink, they give l'chaims, they give toasts, right? So it's a little bit more spread out, it's a little bit more formalized, it's not as freewheeling drinking. So drinking practices are a little different. Number two, they don't drink in the tavern in most cases. Now, the tavern's an interesting place. Both rival cultures get to watch each other and see how each other behaves. And you don't want, especially if you're a minority group, you don't want the majority culture to get a bad image of you as much as possible. So most Hasidic drinking seems to occur in the shtibel, in the Hasidic prayer house, or at the Rebbe's court. And there are very few non-Jewish witnesses in these Hasidic spaces. So that's, I believe, how they managed to pull it off. And the Jews are still considered the most sober and the most reliable for running taverns throughout the rise of this very robust Hasidic drinking culture. And that's what I discovered anyways.
Yeah, I would say that you even see this today, I mean, we see this in America, right? Jews generally, we don't see, at least religious ones, going to bars, but you do. There's in like you said, in shtibel, in shul, by a kiddush, l'chaim. There's a lot of drinking, but it's different. It's not the same kind of drinking, I guess, as what you would see. Again, we're not talking about Americans here, but I'm just drawing some sort of analogy that still seems to be prevalent today.
Well, just anecdotally, I'll tell you, um, often when I've been invited by synagogues to give a presentation on this book, somebody will have the idea to have a liquor tasting as part of it. And I was fascinated to find that when I would speak in Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist synagogues, no one would touch the stuff. They'd put it out and no one would drink it. And when I get into Orthodox spaces, then everybody's, okay, it's time to have our liquor tasting. Great. Liquor tasting with quotation marks, There seems to be a much greater permissibility in precisely the more pious and more, religiously committed places where if you're brought up in America, you would expect the opposite, right? You would expect the more pious groups to be anti-alcohol because that's what American Christianity is like, where alcohol is the enemy. And, you have Puritans here, right? But somehow the Orthodox seem to have brought over this tolerance, for liquor into America and into Israel, but it's less. I think it's significantly less than it once was. And that's the interesting thing about Jewish culture is, all boats to a certain extent rise at the same time. So, yeah, Jews may have drunken less. They may have drunk less than the surrounding culture, but that surrounding culture was drinking a lot. So it's all relative.
Right, sure. And I will mention, so first of all, you do discuss in the book, which people can read the book. I'll, of course, put the link in the show's notes, that a lot of various, opinions from different rebbes and Hasidic figures. So that's the specific stories and sources. Another thing also, we mentioned a bunch here about the stereotype, and like you said, you found it somewhat that the Jew was sober and the Poles, the non-Jews, were drunk. You do discuss a little bit in the book, though, some of instances, stories, sources where Jews were drunk and they weren't only sober. So you do address that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I find cases, really, really sad cases of Jewish drunkenness. And I think it's important to recognize this because Jews sometimes believe their own myth, right? That Jews don't drink. And I'm sure you could find other examples too. And that makes it very difficult to deal with the problem of alcoholism in Orthodox or other Jewish communities today, right? Is this kind of stigma that's attached to it, shikers der goy. This is the stereotype. This is something that is goyim nachas. Is something not that Jews don't do, and of course Jews do it. And the problems could be terrible. And when I looked into this collection of Kvitlach, of petitions to a non-Hasidic miracle worker named Rabbi Eliyahu Guttmacher, I found many cases of drunkenness and hundreds of Jewish tavernkeepers. And the cases of drunkenness are really, really sad. In those days, we're talking about the 1870s, where dowry for your daughter was the key to her being able to get married, which is also an economic thing, right? When you get married, you're also getting a business partner. So it's not just about raising a family. And people admit that they drank away their daughter's dowry, and they beat their wife or their kids. This was happening in these communities under the influence of vodka. And it especially happens when a husband comes back from army service, right? And then becomes acclimated to that kind of drinking climate. And those are also, you have even agunah petitions because the husband has simply fled, or you have divorce petitions where women are effectively trying to divorce their husbands, with the Rebbe's help, by saying, he came back from the army, he's a drunk now, he beats us, and so on. So there's a lot of sadness there, but these Kvitlach allow us to get real about the Jewish past It wasn't all saints. There were sinners, there were scoundrels. Jews are ordinary people. They're just more so. They're enhanced, but by virtue of their marginality, they're enhanced. But they are people.
Sure, and we'll get to Bill Guttmacher a little bit later. That's like, I think, at least one chapter of the book dedicated exclusively to him, and it's really fascinating. But so you mentioned this Jewish underground, that there was this kind of underground, even when these laws were in effect, this was going on with the taverns, the distilleries. Especially you in the beginning, I think it's of chapter 2, you mentioned there's pronouncing it right, Blumrozen affair. There's a really interesting story there. And so perhaps that's something you want to discuss.
Yeah, I think the Blumrozen affair, where one Jew named Solomon Blumrozen turns in the local tavernkeepers because he himself was pushed out. And I didn't want to hypothesize, I didn't want to guess, but now I would speculate that the reason he was pushed out of his tavern was not because of greed or competition, but it was because he was drinking up the product, and he was unreliable and drunken himself. That's a strong suspicion I have, because it took a lot to push out a Jewish tavernkeeper. And what happens in this affair is that the noblemen and the local Jews basically push Solomon out of his tavern, and then Solomon turns to the czarist authorities and becomes an informer, a moser, as say in Hebrew. And he turns on not just the Jewish tavernkeeper who took his place, he turns on the nobleman who owns the taverns and says, by the way, he's also installing Jews illegally, running his taverns throughout his estates in several villages. And this by 1840 was illegal. Jews weren't supposed to be running taverns at all. And so the government gets very, very concerned, and they interrogate everybody. And they interrogate the nobleman, who says, I'm sorry, but I had to install Jews because otherwise I wouldn't make any profits. I can't run a tavern without Jews, which is interesting. He interviews some of the tavernkeepers who say, but I only supplied the liquor. I didn't literally sell the liquor, so I thought I was okay. And most interestingly of all, you've got a case where in the end, the nobleman prevails, and this informer, even though he has the all-powerful czarist authorities on his side, the informer is basically forced to withdraw his complaints, and he admits to being harassed by the nobleman. So it's really a good test of where the real power lies. Yes, you have this all-powerful czarist government, in Poland, but at the local level on the estates, the nobleman is still the determining, governing factor. And so you want to be really close with the nobleman. And that's why the system still works, right? Is because the nobleman is still protecting and employing his loyal Jewish inhabitants. And so that's what the affair showed, all these different things through one single case study.
Okay, and obviously, like I said, there's more that you discuss about the underground. Now, something else interesting that you discuss in the book, which I guess was related to this, so we'll mention this here, is that the Jewish attitudes during the Polish uprisings of 1830 and 1863. So maybe explain a little bit, not much Polish history about the uprisings were, but mainly as it relates to this, as it relates to the Jewish attitudes and how that relates to what we're talking about, taverns and liquor.
Yeah, well, what I would say about that is uprisings, revolts, revolutions, if we're going to make a generalization, not good for Jews, because all these alliances that you've crafted over the years and these power balances get upset, and you can't really choose sides without being punished in one way or another, right? Without paying the price. And so the Poles revolt against the Tsarist Empire, and some Jewish tavernkeepers seem to spy on behalf of the Poles and help the Poles in their uprising. Others seem to spy on behalf of the Tsarist armies and help supply and assist the Tsarist forces. The truth is, the Jewish tavernkeepers probably had to do both. because how else are they going to survive when armed people come into their tavern and demand their help, right? So it's been a real hot button issue in Polish history, because it feeds into this notion of the disloyal Jew that's part and parcel of Polish anti-Semitism. You can't rely on them. They look out for themselves. And yeah, I guess you could say that, but that's only because they're put in this impossible, vulnerable position where if they don't help one side or the other, they're going to be killed, or at least they're going to pay a huge price. Their tavern's going to get burned down. They could be taken hostage, their families taken hostage. So this happened. And so what I try to convey in that chapter is just a sense of these Polish Jewish tavern keepers trying to survive and, helping nobles hide from the Tsarist forces and then helping the Tsarist forces track down these nobles. You can't generalize because these guys are trying to survive. And I wish that message would come across, but in a politicized atmosphere, which Poland is becoming again, it's very, very hard to make that argument.
Okay, so then there are, I'm just mentioning a couple things in the book. You do mention, like you alluded to this earlier, the rabbinic attempts at legislating tavern keeping. There's different shalos v'tshuvos, halachic questions about tavern keeping. You mentioned Shabbos goyim and how to split things up. Those are interesting things. But one thing you just mentioned before, I think we should discuss a little more, is real Guttmacher. So first of all, interestingly, you mentioned he was kind of this tzaddik, a miracle worker, and he got the Kvitlach, but he was not Hasidish. At one point, he was Talmud, I think, or Eger. So talk about who was not Hasidish. So talk about where, first of all, about him. Who was he? Where did he live? And let's talk about it, and then we can discuss how you talk about him.
Sure. Well, he actually lives in the town of Grodzisk, which is in the Prussian partition of Poland. So it's not even Russia or Austria. It's not too far from the border, though. So a lot of Jews are coming over the border for his services. Now, he's fundamentally a Talmid Chacham. He is a disciple of Rabbi Akiva Eger, and he's extremely knowledgeable. But what happens, interestingly, is Jews from all over Eastern Europe believe that by virtue of his scholarly abilities, he has a special connection to God. And he can work miracles. He can intercede on their behalf by virtue of his scholarship. It all begins sort of against his will, he claims, where a father whose son had been possessed by a demon burst into the base medrash where he was leading a class and begged him to expel the demon. And so he expelled the demon. And then everybody starts regarding him as a Rebbe. Of course, he's not Hasidic. And there have been historians, by the way, who tried to sort of fudge it and make him Hasidic and make him a Rebbe, but he really never is. He's a Talmudic scholar who works miracles, and then it gets out of hand. Where really thousands of people are coming to him. They're coming over the border to ask him for blessings and advice and all kinds of miracles, the way you would a Rebbe. And he takes out an ad in a Hebrew newspaper, a Magid, where he begs people not to come to him anymore because he's not well anymore and he needs his rest and so on. And that just makes them want to come even more because look how humble he is, right? This is the way it often works. What I would say, though, is the Kvitlach to him become a crucial source for understanding daily life, because each of these Jewish petitioners, well, many are formulaic, but many of them do tell a story, a life story. My daughter is on the verge of marriage, and she suddenly seems like she's possessed by a demon. My son doesn't study. One petitioner who remains anonymous, and he scrawls a note, confesses to having masturbated and spilling the seed, and he asks for repair, for tikkun, for that. There are all kinds of sexual dysfunction that are displayed because this is very intimate material. But I try not to dwell on that too much. Even though it's a racy subject, what's really happening here is everybody is burying their soul in one way or another. My tavern isn't doing well, or the Gentile nobleman owes me money and he won't pay me back, or my husband is a bum, he drinks a lot, he doesn't make any money, I'd like a divorce if possible, and so on and so forth. And I think it's an unparalleled source for just understanding the trials and tribulations of the Jews of Eastern Europe during this time. And if we're going to talk specifically about tavern keepers, it's just a treasure trove, even just for that, which is what I use in this book.
So I will ask you some more about that, but I want to mention, so he lived 1796, 1874. For those who don't, there are actually, I don't think they're in print, but there's a Shals Teshuvos, I think 2 volumes by Masada of Cook that was printed by him, from him. And there's also Machon Yerushalayim printed, I think 3 volumes of Chidushim on Shas. So for listeners, there is printed, someone once printed also some stuff on Torah from him. There is printed, Svarim from him that people can find. But yeah, so first of all, how did you come across this trove, this treasure trove of Kvitlach? I think it's at Yivo now, right? How did you come across? How did it end up there? How did you come across it?
Well, it's a fascinating story how it winds up in Yivo. Now, part of it's in Jerusalem at the National Library, which is the one the Mossad Rav Kook volume is based on. Mine, no one had really gone through this, and I calculated around 5,000 of these petitions, these Kvitlach. And it was all at one point collected by the Yivo Institute in Vilna. They found these petitions, these Kvitlach, in an attic in Grodzisk. They brought them to the Yivo Institute in Vilna. And, Yivo, being mainly secular Yiddish scholars, they recognized the value, but nobody studied it because it's just too religious. What do we care? It turns out it's mostly in Hebrew, by the way. It's or Yiddishized Hebrew, we could say, with some Slavic elements thrown in for daily kind of language. But it had just sat there, and during the Holocaust, the Einsatzstab Rosenberg had basically taken the entire collection and brought it to Frankfurt to be part of this planned museum to the now deceased Jewish people. So they were going to use this stuff to study the Jewish mind, and there'd be plenty to go on if they were looking for the Jewish so-called obsession with money, because people are very concerned about their economic well-being and their livelihood in these petitions. They would have had a field day with this stuff, but of course it would have been grotesquely distorted. After the war, though, it's brought back to New York, or back to Yivo, which is now housed in New York, and it sat until really I started looking through it. There was a short article in one Yivo publication, but really no one had gone through this. And so this is where I went through this entire collection, and my book was on Tavernkeepers, so I mainly focused on the Tavernkeepers. And the all-pervasive feeling from the Tavernkeepers is anxiety. They may have crafted all these clever ways of evading czarist officials and making a good living sometimes as tavern keepers, but they're living on the edge of a knife. People could turn them in anytime. The nobleman could die and be replaced by the son who hates Jews. All these things start to come out, and you realize it was a very, very insecure occupation to have. And I did not envy them. You really see, and of course, they're Kvitlach, so they emphasize distress. So it might not be representative, but this is undoubtedly a very, very dangerous occupation to be part of.
Right. So so perhaps you have some specific examples you want to give, or so how do you generally just use the Kvitlach? You just try to show that these were some instances that were going on?
Yeah. Again, these are distress documents. So you don't want to generalize the way you wouldn't read, the New York Times or Wall Street Journal and somehow decide that this is what it's like to live in New York. Definitely things that are newsworthy are winding up in these petitions. And so there's a certain amount of, sensationalism that goes into this. But by and large, I just found that they tell a story and they humanize Jews of Eastern Europe, just trying to survive economically, mainly just trying to keep their store, their tavern going, and having all kinds of crisis. The son is drafted into the army. The husband turns out to be terrible at running a tavern. And so the wife has to run it herself. And I'm getting older and I can't run this tavern anymore. Or my enemy has threatened to turn me into the authorities for running a tavern. The most interesting for me historically, though, are those kinds of petitions that allow you to see the effects of emancipation. Because the reason why this economic symbiosis, this system that I described, starts to fall apart is the peasants are emancipated in the 1860s. They want to start running their own taverns, right? So you start to see petitions coming to Rabbi Guttmacher asking him to curse the Gentile who just opened up a tavern across the street. And here, I'll read one of these petitions. It's so colorful. Menachem Moses ben Fega asks for success in the tavern and to repel the Gentile from there, who rose against the Jews and took their livelihood. May the customers not go to him, and may the scent of his drinks become so putrid that they can no longer stand the taste or tolerate his drinks, and to cause his downfall, which all the Jews and the widows and the orphans need, because he took away their livelihood. And also, may the police harass him, so that he is not prospered in what he sells, for he seizes the livelihood of Jews. So you see that those kind of ethnic economies are very much in place. And the niche, Jews are supposed to be running the taverns. Who are these upstarts? But emancipation really begins to make it all fall apart. It takes a good generation before it starts to be felt. But you really see the unintended consequences of emancipating peasants. And that is, they want to open taverns too. They want to run stores too. And Jews aren't eager to let them in as competitors. And that only increases resentment, which leads to anti-Semitism more so. These peasants feel like they can't break into these professions that are supposedly dominated by Jews. And that's where you start to see pogroms. At least that's one factor in causing pogroms and other forms of anti-Jewish violence and boycotts. And I think, the tavern becomes the key to understanding so many of these historical processes beyond simple anti-Semitism.
Right. Now, I guess the last main question that I'll ask you is something that kind of forgot or didn't ask till here is who's Yankel? I'm sure a lot of the listeners are look at the title of the book, Yankel's Tavern. I mean, who? So explain why you chose that title and who is Yankel.
So Yankel, or Yankiel in Polish, is one of the main figures, a kind of minor protagonist in Panta Deusz, which is an epic poem by the Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz that takes place during the partition. So while Poland is under Tsarist Russian control, and the nobles are sort of coming to terms or trying to come to terms with being under the control of the Russians, with Tsarist power. And Yankel, the tavern keeper, is praised for being a good Polish patriot. And so, a lot of Polish Jews who yearned for emancipation and acceptance would point to Yankel as a positive figure of Polish-Jewish coexistence, and by extension, his tavern. It's a place where Poles and Jews could gather together and feel a sort of commonality, a solidarity. And, it's interesting to read this now where, my own feeling about it is, yes, he's a positive character, but to say that Yankel, the tavern keeper, doesn't swindle the peasants and doesn't serve them watered down vodka and so on, it's a very backhanded compliment. It's basically implying that most Jewish tavern keepers do this. So I wouldn't go too far with the philo-Semitism here. It's a very sort of backhanded, compliment to say that Yankel was this patriotic Pole or Polish Jew, as if other Jews were not. But by and large, it was a positive force in Polish literature. And later on, the figure of the Jewish tavern keeper becomes more sinister and becomes really a villain in a lot of Polish literature. Once you get up to these great Polish writers, I mean, really, truly wonderful Polish writers like Jaromski, for example, and to a certain extent, Wyspiański, who their Jewish tavern keepers are not flattering. They're not really part of the Polish people and part of the Polish nation, and they're a negative force. They're holding us back. They're really undigestible as good Polish citizens once Poland becomes an independent country, and that becomes a real problem. So what I would say about all this is Yankel, relatively speaking, is the symbol of Polish-Jewish cooperation and coexistence. And that's the symbol that he's really been accepted as. And, I think we need to read it with nuance, but it's accurate in the sense that, yes, there was a time when Jewish tavern keepers, Jews, were indispensable to the functioning of a local village and small town life. And that's a lost moment in history. And what really brought it home for me is that Blumrozen affair that we talked about earlier took place in a village that's less than 10 miles from Jedwabne, which has become an infamous village or small town where the Polish inhabitants turned on their Jewish neighbors during the Nazi occupation, during the Holocaust, and murdered them in large numbers. Over 1,000 of their Jewish neighbors just murdered them. And that, to me, really drives home the point that most of Polish Jewish history was not like this. For centuries and centuries, Polish Jews did manage to prosper, did manage to have a stable existence. And this is what, for me, the tavern symbolizes, is there was a time, really through most of Polish Jewish history, where Jews really managed to find a place and they were valued and protected. And it's only with the 20th century, the rise of modern forms of anti-Semitism, of right-wing extremism, and then the Nazi invasion, that you have the complete breakdown of that symbiosis and outright murder of Jewish neighbors. But I'd like to say that's not the norm. That's not representative of Polish Jewish history. That the tavern and the Jewish tavern keeper, that's the norm. That's much more representative of Polish Jewish relations.
Okay, so I'll put the link in the show's notes that the listeners can check out the book if they would like to check out the book. And finally, I'll ask you is, what are you working on now? You're working on a new book now?
Yes. So I'm very interested now in returning to Hasidism, having gone on this journey into the taverns, and to really deal with an era that historians have largely ignored, namely the 20th century. Hasidism in Poland before and during the Holocaust. And what I find is that Hasidism becomes very serious in the wake of World War I as a result of pressures of secularization, of state-mandated public school. The Polish Rebbe's become super interested in Torah study and in Torah education. And we have the rise of Hasidic yeshivas that had only really existed for the most part in Chabad and Lubavitcher Hasidism. Now the yeshiva becomes the norm. And what I argue in this book is the Hasidic yeshiva really displaces the Hasidic court. And the Rebbe's are no longer predominantly miracle workers. They're now scholars and teachers. And there are vast philanthropical organizations, international philanthropical organizations that support these yeshivas and cheders and other, Hasidic schools that displace the old style shtadlan. And we're looking at an evolution in Hasidism that I think has gone relatively unnoticed. That is the intellectualization of Hasidism. And my Livisha listeners and readers don't like this because they like to think of themselves as the more learned ones in Orthodoxy. And you can dismiss Hasidic popularity as being, this kind of crude popularism that's based on magic and miracles and drinking and nigunim and all kinds of, supposedly less serious activities. But what I argue here is that these Hasidic yeshivas are at the highest level. They're extremely rigorous, and it pervades Hasidic society now, where it's not just Yeshivat Chochmei Lublin that is, an elite yeshiva. You have many, many Hasidic yeshivas, and that if you're going to be a Hasid now in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, you have to learn, right? You have to study Gemara at a level that's not just at the Litvish level, but where you also imbibe the Hasidic spirit, right? Where you have a musicality to your learning. And on Shabbos, you do the same impassioned nigunim and other kinds of Hasidic modes of worship and dancing and so on. But during the week, you are studying, and you're studying hard, and you're becoming an expert. You're becoming a Talmud Hacham. So the Lamdan, the Hasid Lamdan, however you want to say it, is really the new model of this 20th century Hasidism. And the tragedy of the Holocaust is that it obliterates so much of it. But even in the ghettos, you have these underground yeshiva bunkers where Hasidim are learning, all the way down to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in some cases. And it's inspirational. It's absolutely inspirational. And by the way, it helps us understand the longevity, the resilience of Hasidism, which in American Israel, carries over this intellectual tradition. And so now you have, to be a Hasid today in American Israel, you really need to be a student. You need to be a scholar. And so that's the case I make in this book.
Okay, very interesting. So we'll look out for it. And
by the way, I'm sorry, but the title I gave it is A Higher Education.
Interesting. Okay. And thank you once again for joining me to talk about the Yankel's Tavern.
Okay, thanks so much. It was a real honor.
Thank you.